American Top 40.
At number 34, another debut song in American Top 40 by a 7-member group that evolved out of the Jefferson Airplane, reformed in the early part of 1975. Here is Jefferson Starship and a song from a former number 1 LP called Red Octopus. This is Miracles. Jefferson Starship debuting at number 35 on AT40 with Miracles. 33 hits to number 1 and counting them down.
American Top 40.
This is Casey Kasem with the top 100 hits of the year on American Top 40, and this next song is by a group who won't be left behind as the world moves on. When heavy acid rock was a force in the late 60s, they were there with the right sound. Now, in the mid-70s, songs of love are the right sound, and this group is right with it. They even updated their name from Jefferson Airplane to Jefferson Starship. Their hit is number 84 for the year, With Your Love. Jefferson Starship on American Top 40 from San Francisco, With Your Love, the song at number 84 for the year.
American Top 40.
My name's Casey Kasem. Well, now we're up to the hit song by the famous rock band that looked like it was all washed up just a few months ago. That's when 3 of 7 members of the Jefferson Starship gave notice and left the group. In one deadly stroke, the Starship lost not only its drummer, John Barbada, but its 2 lead singers, Marty Ballin and Grace Slick. And to everybody in the business, it looked as if the Starship would be permanently out of commission and would take its rightful place in the history books as one of the great bands of yesteryear. That is, it looked that way to everybody except the remaining members of the Jefferson Starship. To them, this was a new beginning. Bass player David Freiberg said, under Grace and Marty, things were much too tame. We all wanted to get back to playing rock and roll. To which lead guitarist Craig Chaquico said, we were getting airplay on beautiful music stations. End of quote. So when Grace and Marty left the band, the remaining members not only did not panic, they actually got pretty excited. Freiberg said, we were all thinking in the same direction. We never doubted that we'd find another singer. Well, that turned out to be Mickey Thomas. And this week, Mickey is singing lead on the new Jefferson Starship's latest hit. At number 28, here's Jane. Falling from 14 to 28 this week on American Top 40, that's Jefferson Starship and Jane. 27 hits to number 1, and we're counting them down.
Casey's Coast to Coast.
Now on AT40, we're up to the latest hit by one of the biggest American rock bands of the past 15 years, the Jefferson Starship. But you know, there was a time about 6 years ago when the Starship was a grounded airplane, and the leader of the former Jefferson Airplane, Paul Kantner, was trying to put together a new rock band. But he was having trouble finding a lead guitarist with the right sound. So, to take his mind off his troubles, he looked up a few old high school buddies. One of them had become a high school teacher near Sacramento and had organized a rock band with some of his students. And he invited Paul out to see his amateur band perform. Well, Paul thought the group was okay, but he thought the lead guitarist was just great. He was an 11th grader named Craig Chaquico. He was only 16, and he'd been an avid fan of the Jefferson Airplane ever since their first hit, when Chaquico, by the way, was just 8 years old. So you can imagine Craig Chaquico's surprise when a few months later, Paul Kantner invited him to join the new Jefferson Starship as lead guitarist. And Kantner's problems were over. Craig Chaquico's fresh style sparked the Starship into new directions that paid off with their first top 40 hit in 8 years. That was Miracles, back in 1975. Since then, Craig has not only played on all the Starship's hits, he's even written a few of them. He wrote the band's last hit, called Jane, and he's the co-writer of their current hit, at number 29 this week. Jefferson Starship with Find Your Way Back. Jefferson Starship, their latest at number 29, moving up a notch, is their 6th top 40 hit.
American Top 40.
AT40 originates in Hollywood. I'm Casey Kasem. You know, in the history of the Billboard album chart, there have been only 3 successful groups who have broken up, then got back together again to have a number 1 album. One of those acts is Jefferson Airplane, a star band from the late 60s. In 1971, they broke up. Then 3 years later, the main members, Grace Slick, Paul Kantner, and Marty Ballin, reformed the group as Jefferson Starship. And as the Starship, their 1975 album, Red Octopus, hit number 1. The next group to hit and split and hit again were the Bee Gees. The third group to make this sort of miraculous comeback is the Moody Blues.
American Top 40.
Now we're up to the band whose lead guitarist got his first taste of showbiz as a teenager. He's Craig Chaquico, the guitarist for the Jefferson Starship. Craig was born and raised in Sacramento, California, and the first real professional band he played in, Craig told us, was called Steel Wind. He was only 15 at the time, and all the other musicians were much older. Because he was underage, Craig wore a fake mustache to play in the nightclubs where the group was booked. And for a long time, the disguise worked. With his long hair and phony mustache, this 15-year-old looked older. No one questioned him. One night, however, he had a close call. Between sets, Craig was talking with the owner of the club, and when the conversation was over, Craig finished his drink. Then he says, "I looked in the glass, and floating among the ice cubes was my mustache. I had to run into the bathroom and glue it back on." That was a close call for Craig. The next time he was caught barefaced, however, he couldn't do a thing about it. That's because he was up on stage at the time. The lights were very hot, and the glue Craig used for his fake mustache started to melt. He told us the glue was invisible under regular lights, but when they turned this black light on, it all fluoresced bright green. People could see the stuff sliding down my face along with my mustache. End of quote. And that was the end of that job for 15-year-old Craig Chaquico. A few years later, at 19, when he joined the Jefferson Starship, he'd grown his own mustache, a real one. At number 23 this week on American Top 40, here's Craig and the rest of the Starship, No Way Out. From the LP Nuclear Furniture, Jefferson Starship on American Top 40 with their 9th Top 40 hit. At number 23, moving up a notch, No Way Out. Billboard ranks them, AT40 counts them down. And now we're up to the new number one song in the USA. It's by the band who needed 3 different names, 19 members, and 18 years on the chart before they made it to number 1 on the singles chart. Starting out in 1965 in San Francisco, the band recorded and released their first album under the name Jefferson Airplane. It generated no hit singles. Then they changed a few members, recorded a second album, and this time got a hit record.
You better find somebody to love.
From 1967, that's the number 5 song, Somebody to Love, by the Jefferson Airplane. The band had some more chart hits, but still no number 1 singles throughout the late 60s and into the 70s, along with more membership changes. Then in 1974, they decided on a name change. And in 1975, under a new name, the name Jefferson Starship, they had this smash.
So would I.
From 1975, that's a piece of the number 3 hit Miracles by the Jefferson Starship. In the late 70s and into the early 80s, the Jefferson Starship continued to hit the chart with more membership changes, but still no number 1 song on the pop chart. This year, there was one more name change. They dropped the Jefferson. And finally, after 19 members since the band originally formed 20 years ago, and 18 years on the chart, they've done it. The Starship has flown to the top of the pop singles chart at warp speed. The new number 1 song in the USA is We Built This City by Grace Slick, Craig Chaquico, Pete Sears, Don Baldwin, and Mickey Thomas. Starship.
We built this city.
That's the most popular song in the land, the first number 1 for the band that started out 20 years ago as the Jefferson Airplane, became the Jefferson Starship, and now just plain Starship. We Built This City, the new number 1 song in America. And there you have them, the 40 most popular records in the USA determined by Billboard magazine for the week ending November 16th, 1985.
American Top 40.
From Hollywood, these are the 40 biggest hits in the USA. Now at number 3, we're up to the recent number 1 song by Starship. And the story of how lead singer Grace Slick once quit the group. Happened back in the 1970s when the band was still called the Jefferson Starship. And it was a different group then from what they are today, hitting the charts with mellow pop songs like the smash Miracles. That was one of the problems that Grace had to face. She didn't like what she was singing. She told biographer Barbara Rose, "We had all changed in different directions, and I couldn't continue doing the current style, which to me was aiming for money. The material was not new or interesting. End of quote. But Grace Slick says that was nothing compared to another problem she had. After more than a decade of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and reckless living, Grace couldn't live with herself anymore. Quote, I finally had to face up. I told them I couldn't keep imitating myself, the smart aleck acid tongue of the 60s. I told them I was making my exit now before they had to put me in a nut house. I wanted to be able to change instead of perpetuating this lunatic I had created named Grace Slick. End of quote. So, in 1978, Grace left the Jefferson Starship. She got her act together, got off the drugs and alcohol. She cut 2 solo albums trying to find herself musically. And finally, in 1981, 3 years later, a changed Grace returned to a changed Jefferson Starship. New members and a new sound. They were ready for each other. This week, 46-year-old Grace Slick and Starship are in our survey with their first #1 song. It hit #1 3 weeks ago. This week, it's at #3 in our countdown. We Built This City.
We built this city.
A song that was #1 for a couple of weeks, then last week it fell to #2, this week to #3. Starship and We Built This City from the album Knee Deep in the Hoopla. The lead vocals were shared by Grace Slick and Mickey Thomas.
Number 24.
1986 was a great year for the band The Starship, in public and private life. The band's guitarist, Craig Chaquico, asked his girlfriend, Kim, to marry him. He proposed underwater while they were scuba diving. On the ocean floor, Craig had buried a ship's brass bell engraved with the words, Will you marry me? Kim read it 40 feet down. When they married a few months later, that engraved bell was on the table next to the wedding cake. Ah, romance lives. Here's the Starship with the 24th biggest hit of the year, Sarah. At number 24 among the year's biggest hits, that's Sarah by the Starship from San Francisco. It hit #1 back in March. We're counting down the 100 biggest hits of 1986. I'm Casey Kasem.
American Top 40.
Well, now we're up to the story of a clergyman who's made chart history. He's the only ordained minister to ever hit #1, and he sung on 3 #1 songs. Here's the story as told by the Reverend himself, the Reverend Mickey Thomas, lead singer of the band The Starship. Mickey remembers, quote, a good friend of mine back in the early 70s wrote away to become a minister in the Universal Life Church. He did it because as a minister back then, he could get cheap flights to Hawaii. He also could legally marry people. So when my wife Sarah and I decided to get married, he married us. End of quote. Mickey says a couple of years later, that same minister friend wanted to get married, and he wanted Mickey to perform the ceremony. So Mickey wrote away to the Universal Life Church, but the law had changed slightly by then. Mickey says, you couldn't just send away by mail and become ordained anymore. But because my friend was already a minister, he could send away again and get me ordained. End of quote. And that's how Mickey Thomas got to be a minister in the Universal Life Church. And even though becoming a minister was sort of a lark at first, he doesn't take his responsibilities so lightly. Mickey sees marriage as a spiritual commitment, so he only performs ceremonies for special friends. Like last year, he married a bride named Kim Wittenmeyer and a groom named Craig Chaquico. Craig's the guitarist for the Starship. And this week, Craig, Minister Mickey, and the rest of the Starship hit the top. The third #1 song in chart history, sung by the Reverend Mickey Thomas, is Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now. Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now, the new #1 song in the land from the Starship. And it's their third #1 since they shortened their name from the Jefferson Starship to just Starship. And there you are, the 40 most popular records in America, straight from the official Billboard chart for the week ending April 4th, 1987.
American Top 40.
Now on American Top 40, we're up to the Starship, a band that spent their first 18 years in rock and roll and never scored a #1 song. And when they finally did get to the top, what'd they get for it? Well, let me tell you the story. It goes back to 1985 in Kalamazoo, Michigan. The Starship have just played a concert, and Craig Chaquico, the guitar player, and Mickey Thomas are driving back to their hotel. They're driving a Lincoln Town Car, you know, one of those big, long boats. The radio's blasting away. Then suddenly the DJ comes on and tells them that their song, We Built This City, has just hit #1 on the Billboard chart. Well, Craig and Mickey go bananas. They start screaming out the windows. Craig's driving, and he starts pulling 180-degree turns in the hotel parking lot. That big boat's whipping around, fishtailing, and all of a sudden, bam! Craig and Mickey go crashing right into a wall of the hotel, and they're just sitting there stunned. Luckily, nobody was hurt. But then the Kalamazoo police arrive, and Craig and Mickey have some explaining to do. So Mickey says, look, we're really sorry. Our record just hit #1, first time in 18 years. So try and understand, we're a little excited. The cops see they're serious and let him off the hook. But one of them says, well, I hope you don't have any other #1s. We won't have a town left. Let's just hope they weren't behind the wheel last week, because that's when their current hit topped the chart. And this week, it's still up there. For the second week in a row, here's the excitable band from San Francisco, the Starship, with the #1 song in the land, Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now. Nothing's gonna stop us now, and nothing stopped the Starship from hitting #1 for the third time, and they spend a second week in the top spot with Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now.
American Top 40.
Once a week with AT40, and you know how your favorite songs are doing across the USA. Now, we're up to the famous band who looked washed up 8 years ago when almost half the band quit. Back then, 3 out of 7 members of this group walked out, including their 2 lead singers, Marty Ballin and Grace Slick. They didn't like the band's musical direction and decided to move on. And everyone thought the Jefferson Starship was grounded for good. But a friend of the band recommended a new singer, the man who sang on this smash. In 1976, that song hit #3, Fooled Around and Fell in Love. It was by the Alvin Bishop Band, whose lead singer was Mickey Thomas. Now, when the half-deserted Jefferson Starship heard some tapes of Mickey singing, they were knocked out and offered him a gig immediately. Then it was Mickey who was knocked out. He says, I wasn't a fan of the Jefferson Airplane or Starship. I'd grown up in Georgia listening to soul music. I thought me singing with a Starship? I couldn't really imagine it ever coming together. End of quote. But come together it did. As Mickey rehearsed with the band, he found the new job as the Starship singer suited him just fine. And it's a decision the band has never regretted, because Mickey has now sung on 3 #1 songs for the Starship: We Built This City, Sarah, and Nothing's Gonna Stop Us Now. By the way, Grace Slick beamed back aboard the Starship in '82, giving the band 2 lead singers again. At #11, here's the current hit by the band, who could have called it quits when they lost their singers, but knew it's not over till it's over. The Starship up 3 notches to #11 with It's Not Over Till It's Over. Donnie Baldwin, Craig Chaquico, and singers Grace Slick and Mickey Thomas. Produced by Keith Olson. Well, now we're up to the latest hit for Starship, a band that says aside from making music, their big goal is to help hundreds of runaway teenagers get off the streets. You know, over the years, we've talked about the way a lot of acts are involved in helping worthy causes. And Starship has certainly done its fair share, playing at benefits to help the environment, to save the whales, and so forth. But there wasn't one single cause the band was identified with, at least not until a filmmaker friend of theirs invited the band to his house to see a short documentary he had made on teenage runaways. Mickey Thomas, Starship's lead singer, told us, quote, "It was an amazing film. I remember one kid, he was about 16. He killed himself at the end of the film because he didn't know what choices he had out there. We knew we had to do something to keep that sort of thing from happening." Well, what the band did was offer themselves as the spokesgroup for an organization called the National Network of Runaway and Youth Services. It's a nonprofit organization that offers advice and information and referrals to shelters for runaways across the U.S. The goal of the organization is to help runaways get off the streets, and if possible, back home again. If you're a runaway or know someone who is, the toll-free number for help is 1-800-HIT-HOME. To contact the National Network of Runaway and Youth Services, that number again is 1-800-HIT-HOME. Starship's Mickey Thomas told us that in the 2 years the band's been involved with the network, thousands of runaways have been helped. From that first day, the members of Starship understood that just watching a film on the problem is not enough. And that philosophy can be found in the title of their latest hit as well. Here's Starship at #12 for a second week in a row with It's Not Enough. Holding steady at number 12, that's lead singer Mickey Thomas and Starship with It's Not Enough as the countdown rolls on.
Casey's Coast to Coast. American Top 40.
You're listening to our exclusive AT40 presentation of the Giants of Rock and Roll.
Number 32.
Now we're up to the band who brought the experimental blend of folk and rock music called the San Francisco Sound to the world. Back in the 60s, they sounded like this.
Don't you want somebody to love?
That's the Jefferson Airplane with a piece of Somebody to Love from 1967. In the 70s, they changed their name, and they sounded like this.
If only you believe like
That's the Jefferson Starship with Miracles from 1975. These days, the band is called the Starship. And not long ago, this band that first hit back in 1967 hit with their first number one. Here's the Starship with We Built This City.
We built this city.
The band which helped build the musical sound of the city of San Francisco. First there was the Jefferson Airplane, then the Jefferson Starship, and now the Starship. Altogether, they were voted the 32nd most influential act of the rock era. I'm Casey Kasem. These are the 40 acts DJs around the world voted the Giants of Rock and Roll.
American Top 40.
You're hearing long-distance runners on record spanning the 60s, the 70s, and the top 10 in the 80s. The Triathlon of Rock and Roll.
Number 22.
This next group's a definitive example of rock evolution. This band began in the 60s as part of the San Francisco scene. Then in the 70s, they changed their name and switched to a softer rock sound. In the 80s, they toughened up again, shortened their name, and became bigger than ever. Along the way, they also switched singers from Marty Ballin and Grace Slick to Grace and Mickey Thomas, and now to just Mickey. From Jefferson Airplane to Jefferson Starship to Starship, warping in at number 22 in our special survey, here is Starship's evolving sound.
When the truth is found.
A sonic salute to the Starship. They hit in the 60s as the Jefferson Airplane, the 70s as Jefferson Starship, and in the 80s, rocketing on the charts as just Starship. They land at number 22. Based on Billboard appearances over 3 decades, these are the 40 biggest artists in the triathlon of rock and roll. I'm Casey Kasem.
Casey's Coast to Coast.